On July 25, 1944, Fritz Bayerlein crouched in what used to be a command post. The ground hadn't stopped shaking for hours. Men around him had gone mad, running senselessly into the open. He'd never seen anything like it. One of Hitler's elite armored units was dissolving into craters. American bombers kept coming in waves. By midday, the landscape resembled the surface of the moon. Once the bombing stopped, the Americans advanced swiftly, expecting an easy win after a 7-week stalemate. Then, one by one, the dazed German survivors emerged from the smoke, manned their guns, and got ready to fight back. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, more than 160,000 Allied soldiers had come ashore in Normandy, supported by thousands of vehicles, tanks, and guns, marking history's largest amphibious invasion. However, it was already quite clear that the push inland from the beaches would be a brutal undertaking. The expectations for Overlord were ambitious, to say the least. The British were tasked with capturing Caen, the main road hub of eastern Normandy, on the very first day, while the Americans aimed for Cherbourg, the only deep-water port on the peninsula, within 9 days. But instead of a rapid advance, Cherbourg did not fall until June 27th, 2 weeks behind schedule, and Caen remained stubbornly in German hands. By late June, German resistance had slowed Allied progress so severely that stalemate was a real threat to senior commanders and soldiers alike. In northern France, Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the Western Theater, and the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, concentrated the bulk of their armored forces in the defense of Caen, where the open ground favored tank operations. After a failed counterattack near Caen on July 1st, where Rundstedt bluntly told Berlin that the only option was to make peace, he was immediately dismissed and replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. Despite German reserves dwindling fast, the ever-stubborn Hitler refused to transfer the 200,000 troops to the 15th Army, as High Command remained convinced that Normandy was only a diversion, and the main invasion effort was yet to come. Unbeknownst to them, this was a ruse, Operation Fortitude, the creation of a fake 1st U.S. Army group under Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a covert operation intended to deceive Hitler into holding back his forces. By early July, though they still held key ground in the Caen area, several German counterattacks had failed, leaving both sides battered and locked in place. In addition to the unrelenting German defenses, the Allies faced some of the most challenging terrain in the world: hedgerows. Also called bocage, these ancient earthen banks with drainage ditches along their sides cut across Normandy for miles, dividing fields and pastures into tight, uneven boxes. Over the centuries, the banks had grown thick and tangled, crowned with trees that could rise 20 feet high, their roots binding the soil into something close to stone. For defenders, it was ideal ground. Machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and sharpshooters could disappear into the greenery, turning each narrow lane into a hidden gauntlet. For the attackers, especially the armored crews, forced to stay on dirt roads, every bend felt like the edge of an unseen ambush. According to General Walter Bedell Smith, in the south of Normandy, quote, "Every small field was a fortress, every hedgerow a German strongpoint." But no one had it harder than the 1st U.S. Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. Following the capture of Cherbourg, the Lieutenant General turned his forces south toward 2 critical objectives: the crossroads town of Saint-Lô in the east and Coutances to the west. Beginning on July 3rd, rain, mud, and stubborn German defenses slowed the advance to a crawl, with progress often measured in yards. By the time the city finally fell 2 weeks later, as they dug into their positions in the Saint-Lô-Perrières road, the Americans had taken well over 40,000 casualties. Bradley knew his army could not go on this way. If the Allies were ever going to break out of Normandy and win the war once and for all, they needed something radical. One night in his headquarters tent, as he pored over a giant road map of Normandy, whiskey in hand as it often was, everywhere he looked, the map showed only obstacles. Fields boxed in, roads cut by German guns, everything surrounded by foliage. Then it hit him. The only way through was not with infantry or tanks, but with the full might of Allied air power. If bombers, thousands of them with tons of explosives, could pulverize a narrow rectangle of ground beyond the road they were standing on, the German lines could be softened in a matter of hours instead of weeks. At a July 10th meeting at his headquarters in Crully, General Bernard Montgomery commander of the 21st Army Group, met with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. Bradley first presented his ambitious plan, dubbed Operation Cobra. Both vehemently supported the idea, and Montgomery promised to keep the Germans occupied around Cannes, allowing time for resupply and troop repositioning. But his deputy, General Miles Dempsey, went even further. Rather than simply hold the line, while Bradley prepared his western breakout, British tanks and infantry would hammer the German defenses in the east, drawing their strength away from Cobra's path. The operation would be called Goodwood. On the morning of July 18, 1944, the skies over Normandy filled with the roar of engines as Operation Goodwood began in earnest. With the sun rising, more than 2,000 Allied bombers took to the air, the largest strike of its kind yet seen on the Western Front. Flying in wave after wave that stretched all the way to the horizon, they dropped over 8,000 tons of explosives onto German positions east of Cannes, while offshore, Royal Navy warships in the Bay of the Seine joined in with their guns. On the ground, Montgomery unleashed his armor with 3 divisions of British tanks pushing south from their bridgeheads over the River Orne, rolling out across the open plain toward Falaise. Beside them, Canadian troops pressed into Cannes itself, all of them determined to finish the bloody fight for the city. The plan called for the bombers to smash a corridor, then for the armor to surge through into the open country beyond the perilous bocage. For the first hours, the shock of the bombardment stunned German defenders. All through the morning, tank columns of Shermans and Cromwells clattered forward, crews confident that nothing could have survived the storm of thousands of bombers. But the bombardment had not destroyed Panzer Group West. Under General Heinrich Eberbach, 13 divisions still held positions around Cannes, with dozens of anti-tank guns and artillery hidden in depth. From one moment to the next, the Germans opened fire, using their feared 88mm guns from long range. Rockets rained on the narrow advance routes, and machine guns burst from the villages. Before the Brits even got a chance to recover from the sudden attack, Panther tanks of the 1st SS Division emerged from the haze, firing into their armor at close range. At the same time, reinforcements from the 21st Panzer and even more SS battalions poured into the fight, sealing off every attempt to widen the breach. By sunset, the British had lost more than 270 tanks and 1,500 men. The assault continued for 2 more days, until rain turned the battlefield into mud. By July 20th, Operation Goodwood was stalled. Nearly 500 British tanks lay destroyed or abandoned, more than a third of the armored force available in Europe. Although nearly 4 German divisions were knocked out, the Canadians cleared the rest of Cannes, and another corps gained about 30 square miles of ground. The great breakthrough never came. Of course, Eisenhower was livid. The enraged Supreme Commander even considered firing Montgomery outright. Among the most vocal critics of the overall ground commander in Normandy was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, the Deputy Supreme Commander, who accused Montgomery of deliberately deceiving their superior. Ultimately, though Supreme Commander Eisenhower reluctantly decided to keep Montgomery on, he sent him a scathing letter making his profound disappointment clear. Now, the entire fate of the Allied breakout in summer 1944 rested squarely and precariously on Operation Cobra's shoulders. On July 12th, Bradley, exuding confidence and leadership, stood before his staff and corps commanders and unveiled Operation Cobra, telling them, quote, "I want it to be the biggest thing in the world." Bradley planned to let the bombers tear open the German line, send infantry in to hold said gap, and then drive his armor through toward Coutances, a vital road hub that controlled the approaches into Brittany. From there, the tanks would fan out across the countryside, cutting off the enemy's retreat. The leader relied on saturation bombing to significantly weaken the German positions, and on July 19th, he went to Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, who commanded all air power in the area, to go over the plan. Trafford recommended using 100-pound fragmentation bombs and nothing heavier to prevent the deep cratering of roads and advance routes that had already hampered previous Allied offensive operations in Normandy. Another recommendation was that the bombers approach the target area flying parallel to the American line, rather than directly over the ground troops, to allow the pilots to operate with the sun behind them. To avoid being caught in their own bombardment, Bradley agreed to move his troops 1,200 yards from the target area, far less than the 3,000 yards the air commanders had asked for, leaving almost no margin for error. Across the Allies' path, was the German 84th Army Corps. Led by General Dietrich von Holtitz, these roughly 30,000 German troops were a mix of worn-down infantry, paratroopers, and remnants of armored divisions that had already taken weeks of punishment. Holding a 3-mile-long front along the Senselessly road, right where the bombers were supposed to strike, was Panzerlehr, one of Germany's elite panzer divisions, now with barely 2,000 men and fewer than 50 armored vehicles left. On July 17th, the German position in Normandy took a massive blow, and Field Marshal Rommel, while on the road back to his headquarters after conferring with his panzer commanders aboard his staff car, its canvas top folded back in the summer heat, was attacked by a lone Spitfire from the RAF, guns blazing. Bullets ripped into the car, sending it careening off the road and into a ditch, throwing the Desert Fox out of the vehicle and gravely injuring him. With him out of action, the German army in the west had lost its sharpest battlefield commander on the eve of the coming assault. Yet the coming days would prove that the Americans, too, would soon pay a heavy price for a simple mistake. Although Cobra was initially planned to begin on July 18th, with Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory holding sole authority to set its start, bad weather pushed the day back until July 24th, when the skies briefly cleared and the bombers were ordered to take off. Only moments later, as the clouds rolled back in, Leigh-Mallory, watching from Normandy, canceled the mission. But the signal came too late. That morning, nearly 400 aircraft dropped their loads anyway, and more than 600 tons of bombs fell all over the area, some falling short and taking the lives of 25 Americans and wounding over 100 of the 30th Division. Bradley was stunned. Instead of light fragmentation bombs and a lateral flight path to keep his troops safe, the bombers had flown directly over the lines and used heavier ordnance, cratering the ground and spilling into friendly positions. The only silver lining of that fateful day came when German commander Fritz Bayerlein, mistaking the confused skirmishing for a real assault, moved his Panzerlehr troops into the vacated American positions, unknowingly placing them directly in the path of the coming strike. On the morning of July 25th, the storm finally broke. More than 2,000 Allied aircraft took to the skies, hauling over 4,000 tons of bombs. Flying in tight boxes of 12, the heavy bombers droned in first, dropping stick after stick of explosives across the Senselessly road. Medium bombers followed with high explosives and fragmentation bombs, while fighter bombers swept low, unloading napalm that splashed into fields and villages. Below them, 522 American guns thundered in unison, hurling 170,000 shells into the German lines. Yet, as the dust and smoke climbed into the sky, one lead bomber accidentally released too early, leading almost 80 aircraft to follow suit. For the second day in a row, American soldiers were struck by their own air power. As famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was within that area when the bombers appeared, described the scene, quote, "Then the bombs came. They began like the crackle of popcorn and almost instantly swelled into a monstrous fury of noise that seemed surely to destroy all the world ahead of us. We dived. Some got into a dugout. Others made foxholes and ditches. There's no description of the sound and fury of those bombs, except to say it was chaos and a waiting for darkness." This time, more than 100 men were lost, and nearly 500 were wounded. Among them was Lieutenant General Leslie L. McNair, the man slated to command the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, the linchpin of the deceitful Operation Fortitude. The leader became the highest-ranking American officer to fall in the European theater. Across the fields, the same storm was tearing Panzerlehr to pieces. All through the morning, the planes kept coming like a conveyor belt, leaving the men of Panzerlehr and their commander, Fritz Bayerlein, stunned by their ferocity. As the leader recalled, quote, "By midday, the entire area resembled a moon landscape, with the bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible. Several of my men went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters." Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of the American artillery poured drum fire into our field positions. In a few hours, more than 1,000 men from Panzerlehr, roughly a third of the division's strength along the main line, were either deceased or incapacitated. Only a dozen tanks and tank destroyers could still fight. On the other side of the fight, while a regiment and a battalion worked, extracting American casualties from the misplaced bombs, 3 spearhead divisions, the main thrust of Operation Cobra, finally pushed forward at 11 a.m., moving with an incredibly strong momentum and covering nearly half a mile in less than an hour, expecting no serious opposition. Then, one by one, the survivors of the German line began to emerge from the smoke and man their guns once again, slowing down the Americans' progress under bursts of machine gun and mortar fire. To make matters worse, the bombardment that was supposed to clear the way had instead left the earth damaged beyond recognition, turning each advance into an uphill climb. That day's objectives for the spearheading Americans were the nearby towns of Marigny and Saint-Gilles, only 3 miles past the bomb zone. On their way there, pockets of German defenders turned every orchard, crossroads, and hedgerow into a fight. One American column surged ahead and got pinned at a road junction, caught in crossfire from hidden positions. At the same time, another fought through an apple grove, where German guns were cleverly concealed among the trees, until tanks arrived and fired point-blank into the foliage. At a sunken lane, 2 German panzers blocked the road until bazooka teams crept close and knocked them both out without mercy. On the left flank, another American division, with the task of clearing the road towards Saint-Gilles, was fresh off a friendly fire incident from their own aircraft when they rolled into 3 German Panthers waiting with well-rested infantry support. The Panthers tore through the first Shermans before American infantrymen slipped around the sides and forced the defenders out, leaving a dozen German vehicles lying burning on the roadside. Though the final goal for the day was the village of Évêque-Revon, a small but vital hub on the road south, it wasn't until midnight that American troops finally entered its narrow streets. By then, the sun had long since set, and the breakthrough Bradley wanted was still only 2 miles deep. When the early hours of July 26th came, though the American troops had pushed past the Saint-Lô-Perrière road, the gains were far less than expected. Only a narrow slice of the line had truly collapsed. At his headquarters in Normandy, Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower swore then and there that he would never again risk using heavy bombers so close in support of ground troops. Cobra had begun 7 weeks after D-Day from a line that planners had expected to reach within 5 days of the landings. To the leader, the costly Goodwood was about to repeat itself. Bradley, though, remained confident in the plan. As Eisenhower recalled, quote, "Progress on the first day was slow, but that evening General Bradley observed to me that it was always slow going in the early phases of such an attack, and expressed the conviction that the next day and thereafter would witness extraordinary advances by our forces." That night, across the American lines, exhausted soldiers dug into foxholes, chewed on cold rations, and drifted off, convinced that Operation Cobra had been a complete failure. Yet, across the line, and unbeknownst to even Bradley, the German front was already unraveling. The defensive belt from Lassay to Saint-Lô had been split open in 7 places. Reserves were being thrown in piecemeal, whole battalions marching straight into bomb craters and wreckage. Though the officers pushed what they could toward the gaps, they were fighting blind, while all the while, no one knew that Panzerlehr, once their strongest armored division, had been reduced to little more than a name, and that the key village of Évêque-Revon had already fallen to American hands in the middle of the night. Worst of all, their superior, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, was looking the wrong way. Focusing on the Canadian thrusts south of Caen, kept from Goodwood, for several critical hours that night, the German High Command believed the real Allied blow was still to come in the east. In fact, the true rupture was already brewing in the west, where American troops dozed off in their foxholes, completely unaware they had just cracked the door to the breakout of Normandy. On the morning of July 26th, American infantry were still locked in the hedgerows, struggling over the same objectives they'd failed to reach the day before. Watching this unfold, Major General J. Lawton Lightning Joe Collins, commander of 7th Corps, the main spearheading force of Cobra, made a bold decision. Even though the ground ahead was uncleared and the roads were clogged with rubble, craters, and scattered German defenders, and knowing full well that if the armor bogged down, the operation would finally collapse, he ordered his tanks forward. The push began slowly, especially as an infantry and an armored division drove toward Marigny but could not seize the high ground. Though the town would not fall until the following morning, to the east, the picture suddenly brightened. Edward Brooks, the commander of the 2nd Armored Division, assigned to guard Cobra's flank, decided to drive forward, passing through friendly lines and surging into open ground. Though German fire knocked out a Sherman as the column crossed the Saint-Lô-Perrière road, the division pressed on. By noon, a wave of American fighter bombers blasted 4 German tanks and a gun that had stalled the advance, finally clearing the way into Saint-Gilles. With the city secured and infantry filtering in behind, Brigadier General Maurice Rose, leading the 2nd Armored's forward combat command, pushed his column even farther, sending his Shermans and half-tracks thundering along the narrow roads, tracks clattering over rubble and bomb craters, all while the fighter bombers continued to circle above, ready to pounce on any German armor that dared show itself. While Panzerlehr was the Panzer Division, these wrecked and smoldering panzers and their beleaguered crews could do little to stop them. Through the afternoon and well into the night, Rose refused to slow down, and column after column of armor continued to roll through the orchards and villages, scattering isolated German squads before they even got a chance to organize a defense. Occasionally, a hidden gun cracked off a shot, or a tank brewed up on the roadside, but the column never halted for long. By 2 a.m, Rose's men had driven miles into the German rear and finally halted at a crossroads deep behind the old front, at the cost of only a few tanks, trucks, and under 200 men. Finally, for the first time since D-Day, American armor was in open country, and a clear breach yawned in the German line. This gap only continued to widen all through July 27th, until the real prize, Coutances, finally lay ahead. If the Americans broke through, not only would thousands of German troops be trapped between 2 advancing American corps, but the Third Reich would lose their last chance to hold Normandy. Sensing the danger, the Germans hastily threw together a line of SS troops, infantry remnants, and paratroopers now fighting on foot. Though the Americans failed to seize Coutances that day, instead of stalling, they pivoted south. By then, instead of the despair they'd felt the night before, everyone knew a breakout was no longer a question of if, but when. Bradley saw it too. Cobra had worked, and he had absolutely no intention of slowing. As he told Eisenhower, instead of pausing to recoup and consolidate, he chose to keep moving and, quote, maintain unrelenting pressure. On the 28th, he ordered fresh pushes west to deny the Germans any chance of building a new line, while around Caen, Montgomery's men kept striking to pin down enemy reserves, widening the breach by the minute. More importantly, Bradley finally unleashed his ace, George Patton, the Army's most aggressive commander. Leading his newly formed, yet still not officially activated, Third Army, Patton was handed a block of the force already charging south, and he drove his armored divisions forward at an unprecedented pace. By late afternoon, Coutances, the same town that had cost 40,000 casualties to even approach only weeks earlier, tumbled in a single day. With luck finally on his side, throughout the rest of the day, Patton pressed harder, driving his armor south toward Avranches, the gateway to Brittany. Resistance was weak. Prisoners streamed back by the hundreds, and the columns thundered south. Even when guns flared and vehicles burned on the roadside, the drive never stopped. After 2 months boxed in by hedgerows, no one could stop Bradley's soldiers now. Just miles from Avranches, American tanks rumbled past the 7th Army's own headquarters, forcing General Hauser to flee in haste. As the sun went down, the road into Brittany was finally wide open. On the morning of July 31st, after only a month as commander of all German forces in the Western Theater, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge knew it was game over in Normandy. As he told General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff of the High Command in the West, quote, "It's a madhouse here. You can't imagine what it's like. Commanders are completely out of contact." During the 6 days of Operation Cobra, American losses stayed under 700 men, while more than 7,000 Germans were taken prisoner, and hundreds of their tanks and vehicles were left wrecked across the countryside. During those fateful final 36 hours, the 4th Armored Division alone surged 25 miles. Nazi Germany's defeat was now inevitable. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army was finally officially activated, while Bradley moved up to command the newly created 12th Army Group. Montgomery kept his British and Canadians pressing south toward Falaise, and Patton's mission was clear: drive through Brittany to seize the ports, then wheel east, right into the heart of France. Of course, months of hard fighting still lay ahead, with Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire still bristling with concrete bunkers, and garrisons ordered to hold at all costs. But unlike Bradley's men, who had fought for weeks just to move a couple of miles, Patton's soldiers found the road wide open. Now, the only thing stopping them was fuel. As he took command of the charge that would liberate France and drive straight to the Rhine, he wrote, quote, "So let us do real fighting, boring in and gouging, biting. Let's take a chance now that we have the ball. Let's forget those fine, firm bases and the dreary, shell-raked spaces. Let's shoot the works and win. Yes, win it all."